So I wanted to talk this evening a bit about um, what is it? What is it to engage in spiritual life? What is it to walk a spiritual path? And for whatever reason, this has been a topic that's very alive in me lately, and really I've been chewing on. Actually, I gave a talk already this morning at the Gay Buddhist Fellowship on the same topic. It's always interesting to see how, with a similar topic, how it comes out differently. And I have been reflecting a bit on how it is that so many of us come to spiritual practice. We come to spiritual life from, some kind of ouch, usually, right? There's something. There's something in our mind, in our heart, in our body, in our relationships, in our life that could be a serious ouch, could be serious grief or loss or pain or anxiety, and it could be more of an existential kind of ouch, a sense of, things are going pretty well, but still we discover that when we live in what we would think of as the material world only, when we don't have a spiritual life, we tend to find that we're moving across the surfaces of things. And there is a kind of depth, there is a kind of ability to drop into a moment and allow the moment to expand, to open, to reveal that spiritual life and spiritual practice can offer. Because for many of us, we find that momentum of the mind, of the heart, of our lives is, it's not that it's good or bad, but it often feels not fully satisfying. And I found this story that I read some time ago. I remembered it, and I will wanted to share with you that speaks to this. It's a story, it's called The 84th Problem. And it's a story about a farmer who comes to visit the Buddha. And he says to him, you know, my life is pretty good. I have this farm and I'm producing crops and I have animals and I have a family and I have children and it's pretty good. But he says, my wife and I don't get along as well as we used to, and my kids didn't exactly turn out the way I wanted them to. And, I thought that by now I would have a bigger farm. So you can fill in your version of this, right, in your life. So sometimes we come to spiritual life because something really difficult happens. And sometimes we come to spiritual life more because things are okay, but there's something missing. So this farmer comes to the Buddha and describes his situation and says, how can you help me? How can your teachings, how can my engaging in spiritual life, support me? And the Buddha says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And the farmer gets a little upset. He's like, what do you mean? Like, you're the man, right? You're the guy. You're the one that people come to for help when things are awry. The first noble truth, there's suffering in life and there's this possibility of freedom. Help me out. And the Buddha says, this is a funny response. I'll read it to you from the text. He says, Sir, it's like this. All human beings have 83 problems. It's a fact of life. Sometimes a few problems go away, but soon enough, other problems will arise. Does this sound familiar to anyone? He says, so we human beings, will always have 83 problems. And now the farmer's really upset. And he gets very indignant and says, well, if that's the case, then what's the good of all your teaching? So we all have these 83 problems, and your teaching can do nothing to help with them. So what's the point? And the Buddha says, but my teachings can't help with the 83 problems, but they can help with the 84th problem. And now he's got the farmer's interest, right? And he says, well, what's the 84th problem? Anyone have a guess what the 84th problem is? The 84th problem, the Buddha says, is that we don't want to have any problems. You hear my dog? So this is the thing about spiritual life, that we come in, certainly was true for me. I came to spiritual life very much feeling a sense of brokenness, a sense of wanting to be fixed, wanting to be healed, of wanting, my 83 problems to go away. And it turns out that's not what happens. It turns out that as we engage in spiritual life, our problems don't go away, but how we relate to our problems changes. How we relate to ourselves and our difficulties and our body, our aging bodies, and our mental and emotional difficulties and our troubled relationships, and all of that begins to change. It shifts. And this is a kind of a surprise, really. At least it was for me. And it still is, actually. I still find that we call kind of the worldly mind, it's so habitual that we bring that, of course we do, to our spiritual life. We imagine that we're going to get somewhere. We imagine that we're going to become someone else. And spiritual life isn't ever about getting from point A to point B. It's not about moving across the surfaces. Spiritual life is going from A to A. It's about being right here and dropping down. There's this beautiful quote, which I used this morning, that it's just been moving through me over and over, from Dogen Zenji, who's the 13th century Zen philosopher, poet, founder of Soto Zen. And he says it this way. He says, realization, waking up, spiritual maturity, whatever you want to call it, is effort without desire. This is fully being here. Effort is, it's one way of translating it. I think of it as wholeheartedness. Spiritual life invites us to be wholeheartedly right where we are, without desire. Without desire means without wanting it to be different, without trying to get someplace else, without what the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki Roshi used to call a gaining idea or gaining mind. We all know what that is. If only, when right? And we move through our lives this way, with this idea that we'll get somewhere, that we'll become someone, that will. And it's exhausting, actually, to be in that perpetual movement. It's exhausting, it's disappointing, it's not genuinely fulfilling. And so spiritual life invites us to move in a different direction, to release the desire And, in Buddhism, we have these, it's called the three poisons, right? So the three ways we meet the world that are not so skillful for us, which really desire means both grasping and aversion, wanting what we like and pushing away what we don't like. And I often talk about the reverb that happens because moment by moment, we're leaning into what we want and pushing away what we don't want. And it creates, often when we sit and get quiet, we can feel that reverb in our system. And at the center, the third of these three poisons, which is really the source of the other two, is ignorance or confusion or delusion. So beneath this strategy of grasping and aversion, of trying to get somewhere, there's some belief that we should be able to get away from the 83 problems. There shouldn't be 83 problems. Or if I practice meditation long enough, I won't have 83 problems. And spiritual life kind of yanks that out from under us and says, nope, this is what you have. This life, this moment, right here, right now. And it turns out that when we have even briefly a moment even of not feeling that compulsive push forward or not feeling that kind of knee-jerk rejection and pushing away, when we have even just half a breath, right? Where we're just here. It turns out that being here is, pretty good. It doesn't mean our problems go away. And this being here in this way, it doesn't also mean that we become passive. What it means is that we become non-reactive. Actually, that's not even true. We don't become non-reactive. We're still reactive. I'm still reactive. But I'm not being run around by my reactivity in the same way. I'm watching myself react. Whoop, there it goes again. Whoop, there it goes again. Right? All of my judgments and opinions and views, assumptions, beliefs, they're all there. But as we practice, we begin to see that there is actually a refuge. And the refuge is we don't have to get rid of any of that, but we can also rest right at the center. So when I was in the very beginning of my practice as a young Zen student, I was in my 20s. This was a long time ago, 35 years ago, something like that, a long time ago. I started going to San Francisco Zen Center and sitting meditation and going to hear talks. And I went to hear a talk by this Japanese philosopher scholar whose name is Masao Abe, A-B-E. And he's a pretty extraordinary guy. He was a translator, and I didn't really know anything about him. But I went to hear his talk, and he laid out this very simple description of the spiritual path, which I'm going to share with you tonight. And the thing that I remember the teaching that he gave. I don't really remember any of his explanation about it. But what I do remember was how I felt listening to him. And how I felt was totally wrapped. Like he was just very slowly and tenderly taking my mind and completely reorienting it. And I walked out like in some combination of confusion and delight, like, wow. So I'm not promising that I will be able to do what he did, but the teaching is, it's beautiful and simple. And it's not his teaching, actually. He was quoting 8th century Zen, or what's called Chan in China, teacher whose name was Yuan. And Yuan was reputed to have been an awakened teacher. And he described these 3 stages of spiritual life or spiritual practice like this. He said, when I first began to practice, mountains were mountains and waters were waters. After I had practiced for some time, mountains were no longer mountains and waters were no longer waters. When I achieved final peace, which is a kind of metaphor for when my awakening matured, when I really saw things very, very clearly, he said, once again, mountains were mountains and waters were waters. So just the shape of this teaching reorients us, right? Because we think we're trying to go somewhere. But the beginning of the path and the end of the path are the same. Mountains are mountains and waters are waters. The mountains don't change. We change. Our relationship to the mountains change. And there's a kind of koan that goes with this teaching, which is a question put to the listener of the teaching, which is, well, are the mountains at the beginning and the mountains are at the end, are they the same mountains? And you might watch what your mind does when you try on that question. Are they? Are they the same? Are they different? Are they? This is the mind. We have a binary mind that wants things to be one way or another. And part of the reorientation of spiritual life, of spiritual practice, is that we learn to be able to tolerate ambiguity, paradox, mystery. That the need to put things in crisp, clear boxes, it's this or it's that, softens. And our relationship to the world in that way softens. So let me unpack this a little bit, or I'll try. So the first part, when we first come to practice, mountains are mountains and waters are waters. This is reflecting on what I was just speaking about. This is the world of samsara. This is the world, we might say, of me over here and you over there, in which the world appears to us as a series of separate, solid, unchanging objects that we're kind of bumping up against, right? Meaning we're liking or we're not liking, we're grasping or we're pushing away. This is this kind of horizontal plane, sometimes called the flatlands of our life. There's separation, there's distinction, there's subject and object, there's duality. And in that world, so often, there's so much suffering. The mountains aren't suffering. The waters aren't suffering, but we are. Because how we're relating to them is fraught, right? It's confused. It's limited in some way. So we take up practice. And then we come to this place in which, mysteriously, as it's described, mountains are no longer mountains and waters are no longer waters. This is a sort of traditional description of dropping beneath the surface. The simplest way to talk about it is when we drop beneath the surface of our concepts. And we start to see that a mountain isn't a separate solid object. It's not a solid thing. It's alive. Waters are alive. Life itself is alive. We sit on our cushion and we have this idea of me. And then we try to find it. And as we drop into our direct experience, we get to discover, oh, this is alive too. It's not separate. It's not solid. It's not unchanging. Life itself begins to get more fluid. The concepts don't have to go away. We just begin to see that it's not the only thing that's happening. That there's a whole other dimension, this vertical dimension that I was pointing to. So sometimes we have a glimpse of this in meditation, and many of us have glimpses of this in all kinds of other activity, right? When we are engaging in, some kind of physical activity, when we're in nature, sometimes when we're in relationship, we have these moments when sort of the veils of our cognitive lens that we're looking through soften or open, and we have just a breath of feeling the aliveness of everything. So that doesn't always happen only in spiritual practice. It can happen in lots of places. It is, I think, sometimes what brings people to spiritual practice, because they have a taste of that somewhere in their life. A feeling of non-separation, a feeling of connection, feeling of wholeness, of completeness. And then they sort of say, ooh, more of that. And in my history, there was, I said I came in with a lot of suffering. I had a lot of physical pain, in particular when I first came to practice, and I sat long hours. And because I had so much physical discomfort, I developed a lot of concentration. I kind of had to survive the physical pain. And in that concentration, I had a lot of really expansive and really very beautiful experiences. And then I started chasing those. And this happens a lot in spiritual life, that we have a taste of something and then we bring our grasping mind and we just chase after. So what Chogyam Trungpa called spiritual materialism. We bring our materialist mind and we chase spiritual experience. And this phase, which is mountains are no longer mountains and waters are no longer waters, is in a simple way often described as a glimpse of emptiness. These teachings of emptiness, which just means the non-solidity, the non-stability. Emptiness is not some big empty void. Emptiness means the aliveness of things. And Nagarjuna, who is sometimes referred to as the second Buddha and is credited with being the main teacher of these teachings of emptiness, he has this funny line where he says, people who grasp emptiness are intolerable. So when we get a taste of spiritual opening, of awakening of something, a taste, then we can hold on to it and just become obnoxious, actually. Right? And we see this kind of misunderstanding, I would say, of spiritual life played out in all kinds of ways. I was reading something recently about using the example of the misuse of the movement for Black Lives Matter being translated into no, all lives matter. This is a spiritual bypass. It's ignoring the real differences, the real power imbalances, the real isms in our world and just going, oh, no, no, we're just all going to hang out in oneness. All lives are the same. So we're jumping over and sort of wanting to have our peace not disturbed, right? So that's not the end. It's a doorway that shows us something, that shows us that the flatlands aren't the whole story. But as it says in this little poem, in the end, we come to see that once again, mountains are mountains and waters are waters. And now the very same mountains we have a new relationship with. And in the teachings, it's sometimes described that this second relationship to mountains is described as what's called suchness. Suchness is a teaching in which something is stripped away. And this is the thing about spiritual life, that we come in wanting something, and what we end up having is letting go of something. This morning I was using the example of Michelangelo with a block of stone. And a block of stone is beautiful, but what happens to create a beautiful statue is it gets chipped away. And that's like us in spiritual life. And often we fight it, we don't like it, because it feels like a loss, this letting go. But when we allow ourselves to be stripped away, when we allow our rigidly held views and ideas and beliefs and so on to soften, to open, we allow ourselves to enter the aliveness of our life itself, then something changes. And what changes is not that we get something, but that this kind of pristine purity of life itself is revealed. You know the phrase in Zen, they talk about chop wood, carry water. It's that flavor of simplicity, that we can go about our lives. It's the phrase in Christianity of being in the world but not of it. We don't have to fight with the mountains and the waters. We don't have to grab them or push them away. We can actually appreciate the beauty and simplicity of what's here without the encumbrance of all of what we bring, right? All of our opinions, if you want to keep it simple, about, how things should be, and those 83 problems we shouldn't have, and the 83 things we don't like about other people in the world, right? We go, oh, that's how it is. And again, it doesn't mean we become passive. It means that we can engage from a place that isn't grasping or aversive. We can engage from a place of love instead of aggression or hatred. So there is a flavor of this teaching of suchness, the second kind of mountains, that there's various ways that it's expressed, but I wanted to share with you before we open for questions a little bit about the teachings from the Zen poet, monk, calligrapher, and really kind of rascal, Ryokan. And Ryokan was this very kind of playful, gentle, tender heart. And he became quite a renowned artist and calligrapher, and because of who he was and his renown, his calligraphy became quite, people wanted it. But he himself, just kind of wandered around with his robe and his bowl, uh, hanging out and meditating and not taking things too seriously. And I'll tell you a couple of stories about him so you get a flavor. It's said that he had a wooden hut, and there was a wooden floor of his hut, and from the bottom of the floor there were bamboo shoots that were growing up and bumping into the floor, and so he cut holes in his floor because he didn't want the bamboo shoots to be in pain. So it gives you a flavor of this guy, right? And there's another story about him where he's got this little hut, and he goes off, wandering, and he comes back and he's been robbed. So I don't imagine he had much, but maybe his calligraphy brushes, maybe his bedding. And he writes this little haiku that goes, the thief who came to rob him, he said, the thief, he left it behind, the moon at my window. So even the thief, he had heart for, right? He wished for the thief to see this beautiful sight, to appreciate that mountains are mountains, that the moon is in the window. And my favorite story of his, or about him, is that apparently one time this wealthy merchant really, really wanted Ryokan to do a calligraphy for him, write a scroll for him. And Ryokan didn't want to. And so the merchant, apparently kidnapped him and like locked him in a room somewhere and said, I'm not letting you out until you do a calligraphy for me. And so Ryokan did calligraphy for the guy and rolled it up and left it for him. And apparently when the merchant went to open the scroll, which was, gorgeous, beautifully done, he read what Ryokan had written, and he had said, to read it to you. In the autumn wind, the persimmon picker's testicles are frozen. So this was his haiku, and this was his kind of touche, right? He did what was asked, but he did it in a playful way. So this is Ryokan. And I'll read you one final poem that really speaks to this spirit of engaging in the world from a place of suchness, from a place of what's sometimes called just, like just this. You get to be just yourself, like that. So he says, the first days of spring, the sky is bright blue, the sun huge and warm, everything is turning green. I carry my monk's bowl, I walk to the village to beg for my daily meal. The children spot me at the temple gate and happily crowd around, dragging my arms until I stop. I put my bowl on a rock, I hang my bag on a branch. First, we braid grass and play tug of war. Then we take turns singing and kicking a ball in the air. I kick the ball and they sing. They kick the ball and I sing. Time is forgotten and hours fly by. People passing point at me and laugh. Why are you acting like such a fool? I nod my head and don't answer. I could say something, but why? Do you want to know what's in my heart? From the beginning of time, just this, just this. So At the beginning, I described the beginning of this poem from Dogen, who says, realization is effort without desire. This is the reorientation as we walk the spiritual path. And then Dogen goes on, these beautiful lines. He says, realization is effort without desire. Clear water all the way to the bottom. A fish swims like a fish. Vast sky, transparent throughout. A bird flies like a bird. And just as we see and hear and recognize in Ryokan, Dogen is pointing in this poetic way that the completion of the path is not that you turn into something else, some better version of yourself. No. The bird gets to be a bird. The fish gets to be a fish. And you and I and all of us, we get to be ourselves completely. And we get to be ourselves in this context of vast sky, of the bottomless ocean. And when we taste, when we have a touch of that, it allows us to do what we do, to play with the children, to swim, to fly, to be ourselves completely in this way. So in some way, what we come in wanting and what we leave with are so different. But what we get is to be ourselves in the end, which, is the self that begins and the self that ends. Is that the same? Are we the same or are we different? Right? I'll leave that to you.